there is a complete other segment on evolution in this chapter. We are going to now dive in that segment of evolution. What is evolution? Evolution is actually a process. That process, it's a set of changes that occur over a long period of time. And these sets of changes occur at a population level, meaning that when you consider a bacterial population of E. coli, for instance, the many organisms that make up that population can be genetically different. Because they are genetically different, they respond differently to environmental changes. So that some are going to be to survive, some are not going to be able to survive. Well, why is that? Why is that? It's because of the genetic makeup. Similarly, you are an organism with a certain amount of features. Well, you are designed to live in Ohio. Can you live in Mars? Can you live in the moon? I don't think so, right? As you are, right? So you are suited to live in here. Now, even among living organisms, notice that people who live in Africa, in India, in Asia, in Europe are different one from another, even though they are the exact same species. Nevertheless, they are different, right? Some are black, some are brown, some are white, Caucasians, some are different, right? Now, I'm not going to go into how, socially we define races, which doesn't make any sense in terms of biology, right? We are going to go from the perspective of biology. We have a huge diversity among human beings. Why is that? Because our genetic makeup evolved over time, right? Now, what we notice is that population is diverse genetically. Because of that, all organisms are responding differently to their environment, some being more successful at responding in the environment than others, right? Remember that evolution always occurs at a population level, never at individual level. In other words, you have the makeup, the DNA, the genetic makeup you have. There is nothing that you can do in changing that makeup. So your genetic information is not out of the blue going to change so that you grow gills, right? That is never going to happen, all right? So organisms evolve. Yes, living systems evolve, right? But not at organismal level, but at a population level. I want you to remember that, okay? The organisms that are not adapted in a population are just going to simply die. That's it. And what we notice, and as we look at evolution, we try to understand, what is the commonality among living organisms? We notice that, yes, there is a commonality, right? So much that when we look at features that are found in living things, we can see that, well, regardless of how we put things, we can see that, well, we are all somehow connected. And that somehow connects us to a common ancestor. From that common ancestor, populations grew and genetic diversity became so much, and environmental changes were so much that, organisms adapted in different ways, in so much that they evolved differently, right? That evolution was not necessarily a linear evolution. In other words, it doesn't make any sense to say that you were at one time a monkey and now you are a human being. No, that's not evolution. Okay? That is not evolution. Evolution happens at a population level, and you have a long-term evolution. And how can we see this? We can see this by comparing features that we see among living organisms, so that a common ancestor underwent a change, and that change caused the development of different groups, including bacteria and archaea, right? And archaea, for instance, are going to be found in extreme environments. You're not going to find them in mild environments such as where I'm lecturing from right now. No, you're not going to find them there, right? But where you're going to find bacteria, okay, in that environment, not only where I'm sitting right now, but also on me, in you, on you, right? And then you're going to have organisms that evolve in so much that they became much more complex. These are eukarya, right? And among eukarya, we are going to see a diversity. And that diversity allows us to look into, okay, how are these organisms connected to each other? Can we trace this organism back to a common ancestor, right? Before they became different, right? So that we can, in studying evolution, try to draw what we call the evolutionary tree. That evolutionary tree of life tries to portray how living organisms evolved over time and what is the relationship that exists between this living organism. This is what we see in this evolutionary tree. Now, as you can see, the evolution was not a linear event, right? So we are going to try to explain the unity among living organisms, but also the diversity, right? With the premise that we have one common ancestor. What was that ancestor? That's another story. All right, so how is evolution occurring, right? So today we know for sure the concept of natural selection. But that concept of natural selection was not known for a long time, right? At least people didn't understand or believe that living organisms are connected. Now, there are many people who studied the relationship between organisms, but two guys I would like to mention here. One is Darwin, the other one is Wallace. Darwin and Wallace lived at about the same time. They both were naturalists. These two guys existed in the 19th century, okay? And Darwin and Wallace making many observations among living organisms and how not only they connect with each other, but also with the environment. They came to the conclusion that evolution is actually driven by natural selection. In other words, natural selection drives evolution. How is that possible? Well, this is possible because when you consider a given environment, that environment has resources. It has some conditions, right? You have food, you have temperature, you have water, and then you have interaction among organisms, right? Some organisms are not going to be able to stand competition. What happens to this organism? They disappear. They go extinct. Some organisms are not going to be able to stand abundance of water. What happens to this organism? They disappear. Okay, they go extinct. Only organisms that are suited to thrive in an environment are going to keep existing and leaving behind offsprings. Now, between Wallace and Darwin, the reason why Darwin is the most known, it's because Darwin actually published a book. That book was The Origin of Species. In The Origin of Species, Darwin showed that, well, when traveling the world and looking at different forms of life, that somehow these forms of life are connected in spite of the fact that they are different. Okay? It did a lot of work on finches. It did a lot of work in the island of Galapagos and tried to show that some organisms on the island of Galapagos actually were connected to each other in spite of the fact that they were different. Not only that, he showed that some organisms in the island of Galapagos are connected to organisms that are found in a continent, okay, with similar climate, with similar temperature, with similar abundance of water, okay? So let me close that parenthesis. So today in biology, evolution is the core concept of biology. How so? Because in biology, we are trying to understand organisms. We're trying to understand how they are connected with each other, right? And there is a great value to understanding how organisms are connected to each other. What is that value? Well, for instance, when it comes to treating infections, right? So if we have a new infectious agent that comes and causes a disease, we just encounter that new infectious agent. We don't know how to deal with that organism. If we already know how to treat a disease that is caused by an organism that we now are finding to be similar to that organism, we are going to think, okay, well, let's try drugs that work against the organism that we know of that is similar to an organism that we newly identified to be responsible of a particular infection. Then we try, and then we see that, oh, it works. Therefore, now it is important to know how living organisms connect with each other, right? Just to give that example. Another example, it's for instance organ transplants, right? You may need a heart, and we can think, okay, well, we know that humans have a heart, pigs have hearts, sheep have hearts. Well, when we look at the different hearts, are they similar in organization? If we take a pig heart, can we take that pig heart and put that in a human? Is it going to work? Well, believe it or not, when it comes to organ transplant, it is because of comparing organisms that we tried a bunch of things, right? We saw what worked and what didn't work, right? Let me close that parenthesis. So environmental changes may be caused by living organisms, but also non-living components. For instance, a volcano that erupts, right? It's going to disturb tremendously that environment, right? A winter that becomes so cold that it's now the norm, that, well, we don't even call it a winter now. It is cold all the time. If it's cold all the time, then the living organisms that were there that enjoyed a warm environment are not going to thrive there anymore. They're going to go to other places where they can thrive, right? So a drastic change in temperature, whether it is becoming hot or becoming cold, can affect adaptation of individual to the environment. Likewise, predators can also force an adaptation. For instance, if the prey is easily seen, well, these prey are going to be eaten away. Therefore, the organisms that are going to live in an environment like the kind of environment where I'm living right now, where I'm sitting right now, well, the organisms that live on top of the tree are going to be likely green because you have a bunch of leaves up there. But when you look on the ground, it's all brown, right? So the organisms that need to thrive in here needs to be kind of brown, right? Or else they're going to be eaten away, right? All right. So natural selection, it's a process, okay? It's a process that is going to cause populations to evolve over time. As population evolve over time, individuals that are genetically fit are the ones that are going to thrive, which means that the population is genetically diverse at the first place, right? Because if everyone is the same, you have a cold winter, you are not suited to live in the winter, boom, you have an extinction of one single organism. That's, for instance, what happened with the meteorites coming and hitting the ground, okay? And now all the dinosaurs do not exist anymore, okay? Because the change was so much that, only the organisms that were able to tolerate that change lived. The dinosaurs were not able to tolerate that change, so they got extinct, right? So going back to a population, individuals are going to be different one from another. The one that are better suited to thrive are the one that are going to live in the new environment. So adaptation that result in high reproduction, right, is the one that is going to cause an increase in the frequency of the type of genes that allow that organism to thrive in that environment. And eventually, these genes and these organisms are going to become the new norm in that environment. And that is what we call evolution. So a good example of evolution can be seen in Hawaii, where there are populations of, population, it's not really population, communities, I should say, okay? Communities of honey creepers. These Hawaiian honey creepers occur in many kind. We see them in many kind of size, and the shape of the beak is going to vary from one honey creeper to another honey creeper, so much that they actually don't interbreed, okay? They don't interbreed. Now, look at, for instance, those ones with this beaks this way. Some of them have thin, curved beaks. Some are going to have thick, tough beaks, right? And these beaks are going to vary based on what they eat, right? Some of them are going to eat seeds, so their beaks need to be hard to crack the seed, right? Some of them are going to lick nectar from the flowers. Some of them are actually going to eat some other things, right? Based on what they eat, their bills are going to be, or their beaks are going to be different, right? And this evolution is also driven by the fact that these organisms are going to live in the same environment. To avoid competition with each other, they have to eat different things, or else, well, the fittest is the one that is going to survive. So I'm not going to eat seeds so that, I'm not going to compete with you who is a seed eater. Me, I'm going to eat some other things. I'm going to eat flowers, okay? Or lick flowers, okay? That's typically what happens. But nevertheless, when we look at all these different honey creepers, they can be traced back to the same species of finch, okay? And all this diversity that we see in the honey creeper is the result of natural selection. All right, so they are able to coexist because they're not eating the same thing, and they're not able to reproduce with each other, right, the different species, so that, you know, they all have a life. All right, so the study of evolution can be done in many ways. One way is, for instance, to compare the physical features, right, to compare anatomical features. But other levels of studies can focus on molecular biology. By far today, molecular biology is the one that is the most used to actually study evolution, right? Comparing DNA, comparing proteins, okay? Doing that across living organisms allow us to actually connect or define the relationship that exists between organisms. Now, evolution is very much observed when we look at infectious diseases. An example is tuberculosis. Now, to treat tuberculosis, we use antibiotics. These antibiotics occur in three kinds. We have the first line antibiotics, the second line antibiotics, and the third line antibiotics. The first line antibiotics are these antibiotics that are used when someone is infected with a strain of Mycobacterium tuberculosis that is sensitive, a traditional Mycobacterium tuberculosis strain. Now, it so happened that because of the misuse of antimicrobials, now we have some strains of Mycobacterium tuberculosis that are resistant to first-line drugs, right? These ones are what we call multi-drug resistant. The multi-drug resistant strains are more difficult to treat, which is a problem. And nowadays, we even have strains of Mycobacterium tuberculosis that are not only multi-drug resistant, they are actually resistant to even second-line drugs. These ones are going to be the extensively drug resistant, right? So now, tuberculosis is one example of evolutionary adaptation, right, to use of antimicrobials. Another one is methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus, so or MRSA. Methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus developed because of misuse of antimicrobial in hospitals and different places, right? Another good example of evolution that I'm going to mention here is the seasonal flu vaccine. Now, every single season, you are offered to take a vaccine to get protected against flu. Why do we do that? We do that because influenza virus varies tremendously from one season to another, okay? These variations are such that when we produce one vaccine in one season, that vaccine is not going to work for another season because of the genetic variety that is so much that, you know, the antibodies, or actually the target we used in the previous season, are not the same targets that are in this season. So we have to produce new vaccines all the time, okay? Now, as we look at the diversity of living organisms, we have to get organized. We have to organize organisms based on what they look like, how they behave, how they respond, based on many aspects, right? so that we have subdisciplines in biology that focus exclusively on that. An example of subdiscipline is taxonomy. Taxonomy is a discipline that focuses on naming biological systems, but also classifying biological system according to a certain number of rules that we are going to define. So taxonomy is for naming and classification, while systematics, it's another subdiscipline in biology that focuses on classifying organisms based on their presumed evolutionary relationship. In other words, systematics is going to allow us to draw evolutionary trees, right? What we call phylogenetic trees. We are going to talk about this at a later time when we talk about evolution. All right. So, with that being said, because of the need to classify organisms, we're going to classify them in groups, right? So these groups are going to go from big groups to subgroups to sub-subgroups to even smaller groups, so that we have a big level of organization and the smallest level of organization. When it comes to living things, the biggest level of organization is going to be domains, right? There are 3 domains: the domain of bacteria, the domain of archaea, and the domain of eukarya, right? They are all different, okay? Then, underneath of the domains, we are going to have kingdoms, right? The domain is the most inclusive level of organization when we classify living organisms. Then the next level, it's the level of kingdom, right? And then underneath of the kingdom, we are going to have the level phylum, right? One phylum, several phyla, okay? And underneath of phylum, we're going to have class. And from class, we're going to have order. From order, we're going to have family. From family, we're going to have genus. From genus, we're going to have species, which is the least inclusive level of classification of organisms, right? So I'm going to ask you to remember, right, the most inclusive level and the most exclusive level. The species is the most exclusive level. The domain is the most inclusive level. All right. So the domain of archaea is made up of prokaryotic organisms. These are single-celled organisms. They are very simple in structure. They are not, they don't have their DNA enclosed in an envelope. Therefore, they don't have a nucleus, right? They are unicellular, right? It is thought that this organism may have been the first organism to appear on Earth. Why do we think that? We think that because these organisms are typically found living in extreme environment, for instance, salt lakes, in extreme cold, in extreme heat, for instance, hydrothermal vents, right? So these organisms live in extreme environment. Then, a little closer to us, we have bacteria. Bacteria are unicellular organisms. They are prokaryotic organisms, meaning that they do not have their DNA enclosed in an envelope, right? So they have no nucleus, right? They are found almost everywhere. They are found on Earth. They are found on you. They are found in you. They are found almost everywhere we human can go. We're going to find bacteria there. And then we're going to have eukarya. Eukarya is this huge domain that going to be subdivided into 4 different kingdoms, right? The first kingdom I would like to mention is the kingdom of protists. Protists are typically single-celled organisms, but some of them are multicellular organisms, right? Most protists are actually uh, photosynthetic organisms, but many of them are also non-photosynthetic, right? They are consumers rather than being photosynthetic or producers. Okay, so again, eukarya, these are eukaryotic organisms, right? Protist is a eukaryotic organism, right? This can be unicellular but also multicellular. They are characterized by the fact that, as opposition to prokaryotic cells, these ones have a membrane-bound nucleus. In other words, the DNA is enclosed in an envelope. Okay? So, when we look at the different kingdoms, I already mentioned the protist. Sorry, in this forest, there is a bunch of bugs, and boy, I have to chase them. Anyway, so going back to my presentation, we have plants, the kingdom of plants, we have the kingdom of animals, and we have the kingdom of fungi. Okay, so now these days, because of the molecular developments and what we know about molecular organization of life, nowadays, boy, we are actually considering changing the way we organize life. There are new taxonomic groups, right? This new taxonomic group is grouping eukaryotic organisms into 5 supergroups. Okay, 5 supergroups, and these groups are basically designed based on some molecular features. Okay, all right. So, how do we name organisms? We talked about taxonomy, right? Taxonomy is the discipline that allows us to name organisms. But what is the technique that we use to naming organisms? Well, we are going to use a binomial system. That binomial system means that every single organism we're going to name has 2 names. We have a first name that has the first letter always capitalized, and the second name that has the first letter of the word never capitalized. Now, let's take the example of Pisum sativum. Pisum sativum, it's a scientific name for garden pea, right? The first name, Pisum, is the name of the genus, while the second name, sativum, is the name of the species, okay? So that naming system is universal, right? Whether you are in Europe, in Africa, in America, in Asia, we use the same naming so that, we understand each other.